Before we start, if you're already enjoying this type of content, don't forget to leave a like. It really helps the channel. You're about to witness one of the most incredible survival stories ever recorded. A man alone in extreme conditions, facing temperatures that would kill an unprepared person in minutes. But what happened inside that shelter? That's where this story takes an unexpected turn that shocked everyone who discovered the truth. Thomas Brennan had always been a solitary man. At 53 years old, he'd spent the last 2 decades working as a mountain guide in the Colorado Rockies, leading tourists through treacherous terrain and teaching them the ways of the wilderness. But Thomas wasn't just a guide by profession. He was a guide by nature. Mountains called to him in a way that people never could. The silence of high altitude, the raw honesty of stone and snow, the way the world simplified itself at elevation, these things made sense to him. In late November, after a particularly harsh season of guiding, Thomas decided he needed time alone. Real alone. Not the kind of alone where you're still tethered to civilization by a satellite phone or a hiking partner waiting at base camp. He wanted complete solitude, at least for 2 weeks. He told his sister, Margaret, that he'd be checking in via a satellite device every 3 days. She wasn't happy about it, but she knew better than to argue with Thomas when his mind was set. The forecast called for temperatures dropping to around -40 degrees Celsius, unusually cold, even for the high peaks in November. Thomas had been in worse conditions before, or so he thought. He packed his gear methodically. A high-altitude tent rated for extreme cold, a propane stove, freeze-dried food, water purification tablets, a medical kit, and layers upon layers of insulated clothing. His backpack weighed 45 pounds, substantial but manageable for someone with his experience. By day 4 of his solo expedition, Thomas had established a pattern. He'd hike until late afternoon, set up camp on relatively sheltered ground, and spend his evenings reading by headlamp and writing in a journal he'd brought specifically for reflection. The solitude was exactly what he'd needed. His mind, usually cluttered with logistics and safety protocols from his guiding work, had finally quieted. He could think clearly for the first time in months. But on the 5th day, everything changed. The weather system that meteorologists had predicted arrived early and with far greater intensity than anyone expected. What should have been a standard cold front transformed into a genuine blizzard. Thomas noticed the sky darkening around mid-morning, darker than it should have been at that hour. The wind picked up within 30 minutes, and within an hour, visibility dropped to nearly 0. He realized immediately that he was in serious trouble. He'd set up camp that morning in what he thought was a reasonable location, a small plateau with some rock formations to one side. It had seemed adequate at the time. But now, with the wind howling with increasing ferocity and snow falling so thickly he couldn't see his own boots, Thomas understood that his chosen spot was dangerously exposed. He needed to find real shelter, and he needed to find it now. If you're enjoying the video so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. And drop a comment telling me what you think about Thomas's situation right now. Thomas secured his tent as best he could, driving additional stakes deep into the frozen ground. But even as he did this, he knew it wouldn't be enough. The wind was becoming stronger, more violent. He could hear it screaming across the mountain, a sound almost alive in its intensity. Snow was accumulating on his tent in real time, and drifts were forming against it. If the wind picked up much more, the tent would simply be torn away. He made a decision that would define everything that followed. He would abandon the tent and search for a natural shelter. There had to be caves or deep crevices in the rock formations he'd seen nearby. It was a dangerous move. Leaving his camp in a whiteout conditions was risky, but staying was riskier. He marked his position with bright orange flagging tape tied to his tent frame, grabbed his emergency pack with water, food, and fire-starting materials, and ventured into the white chaos. The wind was so powerful that walking was almost impossible. Thomas bent nearly double, using his ice axe to maintain stability with each step. His lungs burned from breathing in air so cold it felt crystalline. The world had reduced itself to white, nothing but white in every direction, with only the ghostly outlines of rocks occasionally emerging from the snow like shipwrecks in fog. He searched for what felt like hours, but was probably only 40 minutes. His fingers were going numb despite his heavy gloves, and his face felt like it was being stabbed by 1,000 ice needles. Hypothermia was becoming a real concern. He was losing his sense of direction, losing his clarity of thought. This was how people died in mountains, not in dramatic falls or avalanches, but in quiet surrender to cold and confusion. Then, through the swirling snow, he saw something that made his heart surge. A dark opening in a rock face. It was small, barely visible, but it was definitely there. Thomas forced his legs forward and reached the opening. Using his hands, he felt along the edges. It opened into a crevice, a natural space between two massive boulders. It wasn't a cave exactly, but it was shelter, and at this moment, it was everything. He crawled inside, dragging his emergency pack behind him. The wind immediately became distant, muted. The temperature inside was still cold, brutally cold, but it was perhaps 30 degrees warmer than outside. Thomas's body began to shake uncontrollably. He recognized this as a sign of severe hypothermia setting in. He needed to generate heat, and he needed to do it now. This is where his 2 decades of mountain experience would be tested like never before. The darkness inside the crevice was nearly absolute. Thomas switched on his headlamp, and the beam cut through the black, revealing his new world. The space was roughly 8 feet deep and about 6 feet wide at the widest point, larger than he'd initially thought. The ceiling varied in height, from around 7 feet at the entrance to lower points deeper inside. The walls were rough stone, and the floor was relatively flat with a layer of ice and compressed snow. His teeth were chattering so violently he could barely think. He knew he was experiencing stage 2 hypothermia. His core temperature had dropped enough that his body was beginning to shut down non-essential functions. If he didn't reverse this trend within the next hour, he would likely slip into stage 3, where confusion and lethargy would make rational decision-making impossible. He had to work fast. Thomas spread out his emergency pack and took inventory of what he had. Inside was a metal camping stove, 3 canisters of propane fuel, waterproof matches and a lighter, several energy bars, a water bottle, a small first aid kit, and a compact sleeping bag. Not his main one, which he'd left at camp, but an emergency lightweight version. It was all he'd grabbed in his panic. It would have to be enough. The first priority was heat. He assembled the camping stove with shaking hands, fumbling with the connection between the stove and the propane canister. It took him 3 attempts to get it right, but finally he was able to ignite it. The small blue flame that emerged was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. He positioned the stove carefully on a relatively flat section of stone, ensuring it was stable. The heat radiating from it was minimal in the context of the massive cold surrounding him, but it was something. It was hope. He sat as close to the stove as he safely could, holding his bare hands up to the flame. Not too close, because frostbite could be just as deadly as hypothermia, but close enough to receive whatever warmth the stove could provide. Gradually, over the course of 10 minutes, his shaking began to subside slightly. His mind became a bit clearer. He drank some water, cold water, but water, and ate half of an energy bar, forcing himself to chew slowly and deliberately. As his immediate crisis stabilized, Thomas began to explore his shelter more carefully. He used his headlamp to examine the walls and ceiling. The rock was dark and solid, with patterns of lighter mineral veining running through it. At the back of the crevice, he noticed an area where water must have seeped through the stone during warmer months. There were icicles hanging from a crack in the ceiling, beautiful and deadly. He realized he needed to think about this situation strategically. The weather outside was catastrophic. There was no possibility of him safely leaving the crevice until the blizzard passed. That could be 6 hours, or it could be 2 days. He needed to ration his supplies carefully while maintaining enough heat to survive. If you're liking what you're hearing so far, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps. And drop a comment about what you think Thomas should do next. Thomas decided his strategy. He would use the stove for 1 hour at a time, then shut it off for 30 minutes to conserve fuel. During the off periods, he would keep moving, doing exercises to maintain circulation and body heat. He would ration his food carefully, 1 energy bar every 3 hours, small sips of water throughout. The small sleeping bag would provide crucial insulation when he lay down. The hours that followed blurred together. Time became meaningless in the darkness of the crevice. Thomas read the same pages of his journal repeatedly, each word becoming more and more abstract. He did push-ups against the stone floor until his arms burned. He stood and did lunges, jumped in place, anything to keep his body active. Between stove cycles, he'd sit in the darkness and think about his life, about Margaret, about the mountains he'd guided so many people through, about the choices that had led him to this moment. Around what he estimated was midnight, exhaustion finally overtook him. He wrapped himself in the emergency sleeping bag. It was thin and not designed for this kind of extreme cold, but it was better than nothing, and lay down on the least uncomfortable section of the stone floor. He positioned himself to keep the stove in his line of sight, worried that if he fell asleep, he might accidentally knock it over. He slept fitfully, waking every hour or so, disoriented and confused before slowly remembering where he was. Each time he woke, he'd turn the stove on again, wait until he felt stable, then turn it off. Outside, the wind continued to howl. The sound was haunting, almost alive. By what Thomas calculated was early morning on the second day, the wind seemed to be lessening slightly. The opening of the crevice was now completely blocked by snow, a solid white wall, which actually improved the shelter by creating additional insulation. Thomas was down to 1.5 propane canisters. His food supply was nearly exhausted. He had perhaps enough for 1 more full day of rationing, maybe 2 if he ate very sparingly. He knew that if the weather didn't clear soon, he would be facing a genuine life or death situation. He had a satellite device in his emergency pack, but he'd decided to save it. Using it now might trigger a rescue that could be dangerous given the current weather conditions. Mountain rescue in a blizzard often ended tragically. He'd wait a bit longer. But as the hours crawled by, Thomas began to realize something else was happening. The sounds outside were changing. The relentless roar of the wind was being replaced by something else, something that sounded almost like voices, confused and distant. Thomas first thought he was imagining things. The human mind, when isolated and under stress, often conjures sounds that aren't there. Auditory hallucinations were a documented symptom of prolonged altitude exposure combined with extreme cold. He tried to dismiss the distant sounds as wind patterns echoing through the rock formations. But then he heard it again. A voice, definitely a voice, male, shouting something he couldn't quite make out. Thomas's first instinct was disbelief, followed by a spike of hope, so intense it almost hurt. He scrambled to the opening of his crevice and began digging frantically at the snow, blocking the entrance. His fingers were going numb again, but he didn't care. If there were people out there, maybe they could help. Maybe someone had realized he was missing. After 5 minutes of intense digging, he'd created a small hole through which he could see outside. The blizzard had indeed lessened, though snow was still falling heavily. Visibility was perhaps 50 yards instead of 10 feet, and there, moving slowly through the snow roughly 30 yards from his shelter, were 3 figures bundled in heavy winter gear. "Hey!" Thomas shouted through the hole, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Hey! I'm here!" The figures stopped. One of them turned in his direction. Thomas saw an arm raise, pointing toward his shelter. The three figures began moving toward him. As they got closer, Thomas could make out details. They were all men, and they all looked nearly as desperate as he felt. One of them was limping badly, and another seemed to be supporting most of his weight. They wore mismatched gear. Some pieces looked expensive and modern, while others looked old and worn. Most strikingly, none of them looked fully prepared for the extreme conditions they were in. "Are you hurt?" Thomas called out, his guide's instinct kicking in automatically. "We crashed," the closest one called back. "Plane went down yesterday evening. We've been walking since dawn trying to find shelter. We saw your light through the snow." A plane crash. That explained their disheveled appearance and their insufficient gear. They'd survived an emergency landing in the mountains and had been trudging through a blizzard trying to find safety. Thomas helped them into the crevice one by one. As they collapsed inside, he could see they were all suffering from varying degrees of hypothermia and exhaustion. The man who'd done most of the talking was a pilot, maybe in his mid-40s. His name was Captain David Reeves. The second man, who was limping, was a passenger named Marcus Chen. He'd twisted his knee badly during the crash landing. The third man was younger, perhaps early 30s, and introduced himself as Dr. James Patterson. He was a physician, and his medical training would prove unexpectedly valuable. "Thank God," Marcus said, collapsing onto the stone floor. "We didn't think we were going to make it. The wind was just relentless." Thomas quickly assessed the situation. There were now 4 men in a space barely large enough for one. He had fuel and food for perhaps one more day, but more immediately, these men needed heat and assessment. Dr. Patterson was already examining Marcus's knee, gently removing his boot to check for damage. "It's a bad sprain," Patterson said quietly. "Not broken, but he won't be walking far on it." Thomas turned on the stove again and began heating water in a metal cup he'd brought. As the water warmed, he divided his remaining food supplies into 4 portions. It wasn't much, some energy bars, beef jerky and compressed fruit, but combined with warm water, it would help. If this story is keeping you interested, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It means a lot. And drop a comment about what you think happens next. As the 4 men sat around the small stove, Captain Reeves explained their situation. They'd been flying a charter flight from Denver to a medical conference in Jackson Hole. The flight had been routine until they began their descent. A violent wind shear had hit the small aircraft, sending it into a steep dive. Reeves had managed to level the plane enough to attempt an emergency landing, but he'd had to put it down in a high valley surrounded by mountains. "The impact was hard," Reeves said, his voice still shaky with the memory. "But we all managed to get out. The plane caught fire shortly after. Electrical damage, I think. We couldn't salvage anything. All our supplies were destroyed in the initial crash. All we had was what we were wearing, and it wasn't nearly enough for these conditions." "How long did you walk?" Thomas asked. "Since dawn, maybe 6 hours, though it felt like 16. We were starting to accept that we weren't going to make it when we saw your light through the snow." Thomas processed this information. A plane had crashed in the mountains. Someone, somewhere, would eventually realize that the flight hadn't arrived at its destination. Search and rescue teams would be mobilized. But with this weather, rescue was unlikely to happen quickly. The 4 men might need to survive together in this crevice for quite some time. What Thomas didn't know yet was that the situation was even more complicated than it appeared. Dr. Patterson had noticed something about Marcus during the initial examination, something that would require difficult decisions in the coming hours. As the men sat in the flickering light of the small stove, Thomas began to realize that his solitude was well and truly over. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he would face them as part of a team, for better or worse. And in the mountains, where survival often came down to split-second decisions and the will to endure, that would make all the difference. Outside, the snow continued to fall, and the wind continued to howl. But inside the stone crevice, 4 strangers had found shelter. What would unfold over the next days would test them in ways none of them could have imagined. By the next morning, as Thomas calculated it, the group was facing serious problems. The propane was nearly gone, maybe enough for 2 more hours at normal burn rate. The food situation was critical. Thomas's calculations suggested they had perhaps 1 day of minimal rations left, if they were careful. But the most pressing concern was Marcus's health. Dr. Patterson had examined him again during the morning hours. Time had become arbitrary in the eternal darkness of the crevice, and his verdict was troubling. Marcus's knee was severely swollen, and more concerning, Patterson detected signs of infection beginning at the site where the initial injury had broken the skin. In normal circumstances, antibiotics and proper medical care would address this issue without complication. Here, with no antibiotics, limited water for cleaning, and no way for Marcus to move, the infection could become life-threatening. "How bad?" Thomas asked quietly, pulling Patterson aside to the far end of the crevice where their conversation wouldn't alarm the others. "Bad," Patterson said flatly. "The infection is already starting. If it progresses to sepsis, well, we don't have the tools to treat that. He could die." Thomas felt the weight of that statement settle on his shoulders. He'd made decisions as a guide before, decisions about turning back on climbs, decisions about who was fit to continue and who needed to be evacuated. But those decisions had always been made with the understanding that help was relatively close by. Here, help was hundreds of miles away. "What can we do?" he asked. "Keep it clean, elevated, use anything we can to reduce the swelling. But honestly, Thomas, we need to get him off this mountain. Walking is impossible for him now. The pain alone would be traumatic, but he needs proper medical attention within days, not weeks." Thomas looked back at Marcus, who was attempting to sleep despite the obvious pain he was in. Captain Reeves sat nearby, staring at nothing, his pilot's mind probably replaying the crash over and over, looking for the moment where things had gone wrong. Thomas made a decision. He activated his satellite device for the first time since his emergency. The device took several minutes to acquire a signal, but eventually it connected. Thomas typed out a message. "Mountain shelter location coordinates." He provided his GPS location. "Plane crash survivors, 4 men, 1 with infected leg injury, need urgent evacuation. Weather currently severe. Stand by for updates." The response came back within minutes. "Received. Weather conditions prohibit immediate rescue. Search and rescue team standing by. Maintain contact." "Do survivors need emergency medical guidance?" "Yes," Thomas replied. "1 infected wound. Doctor present but no antibiotics." There was a pause of nearly 10 minutes before the response came back. "Connecting SR team with Dr. Patterson. Prepare survivors for communication." Thomas called Patterson over and explained the situation. Patterson took the device and spent the next hour in detailed communication with the Mountain Rescue Medical Coordinator, receiving instructions on wound care that could be administered with minimal resources. The coordinator recommended they use their precious water supply very carefully, boiling it when possible to sterilize it, then using it to clean the wound multiple times daily. They discussed potential complications and warning signs that Patterson should monitor. If you're finding this story intense, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. It really means a lot to me. And share a comment about whether you think they'll make it out of this situation. With the satellite device communication complete, Thomas conserved the battery by turning it off. He estimated they had another 3 days of battery life if used sparingly, but the device had served its crucial purpose. They were now in contact with the outside world. Rescue was not immediately possible, but it was no longer theoretical. It was coming. The next problem was more immediate: fuel and food. Captain Reeves approached Thomas that afternoon with an idea. "We could try to use the plane wreckage," he said. "I know the location roughly, maybe 2 miles from here, southeast based on the direction we walked. There might be supplies we can salvage, or at least materials we could use for fuel." Thomas's first response was to say it was impossible. The weather, though improved from the blizzard, was still severe. Visibility was marginal, the terrain was treacherous. But as he looked at Marcus's swollen, infected knee, and as he calculated the remaining supplies, he realized Reeves might be right. "I'll go," Thomas said. "You stay here with Marcus and Patterson. I'll mark a trail with flagging tape so I can find my way back." "I should go," Reeves said. "It's my plane. I know exactly where it should be." They debated for nearly an hour, but ultimately Thomas prevailed. At 53, he had more mountain experience and was better acclimated to the altitude. Reeves was still suffering from the shock of the crash and the subsequent survival ordeal. So, early the next morning, Thomas prepared for a dangerous journey back down the mountain. He took the satellite device, not to use, but as a safety measure. He marked his exit from the crevice with bright orange flagging tape and established a waypoint on his GPS unit based on Reeves's description of the crash site location. He carried the ice axe, some rope, and a small pack containing water and energy bars. As he stepped out into the cold morning air, leaving the relative warmth of the shelter behind, he was acutely aware that if anything went wrong on this journey, he might not return. And if he didn't return, the other 3 men would face a slow decline as their resources ran out. The mountains, Thomas had always known, were indifferent to human survival. They would kill you just as readily as they would shelter you. The difference between life and death often came down to decisions made in moments of uncertainty, decisions that you couldn't second guess because there was no time for regret. He descended into the white landscape, following his GPS and his instincts, hoping both would prove reliable. The hike down the mountain was more difficult than Thomas had anticipated. The snow was deeper than he expected, and the wind, though not as violent as during the full blizzard, still had strength enough to frequently knock him off balance. He found himself grateful for the weight of the mountains themselves. At least the terrain was familiar. He knew how mountains worked, how to read them, how to move through them safely. After roughly 90 minutes of careful descent, following his GPS, Thomas spotted something dark against the white landscape below, the wreckage of the small aircraft. It was worse than he'd imagined. The plane had come down hard, and the impact had torn it apart. The fuselage was cracked along the seams, with sections twisted at unnatural angles. The wings were largely intact, though one was crumpled upward at the tip. The tail section had broken away from the main body. The entire aircraft was covered in a layer of ice and snow, making it look more like a rock formation than a machine. Thomas approached cautiously, moving through the snow toward the main wreckage. The fire that Reeves had mentioned had apparently burned itself out. There was evidence of scorching on parts of the aluminum fuselage, but nothing was currently aflame. Smoke had long since dissipated into the mountain air. He examined the exterior first, looking for anything useful. The landing gear was twisted, and the door had been torn off during impact. Using his ice axe, Thomas carefully pried open a cargo compartment in the rear of the fuselage. Inside, he found several sealed metal cargo boxes. His heart lifted. This might contain supplies that had survived the crash intact. The boxes were locked, but Thomas managed to force 2 of them open using his ice axe as a pry bar. Inside the first was weather equipment, barometers, thermometers, and other meteorological instruments. Useful perhaps in other circumstances, but not helpful for immediate survival. The second box contained something better, communication equipment, some of it damaged, but some potentially salvageable. More importantly, beneath the electronics, he found blankets, heavy insulated blankets that would be enormously valuable back at the shelter. He kept searching. The cockpit was accessible, and after carefully moving through the twisted metal, Thomas found Reeves's flight bag. Inside were maps, various documents, and importantly, a first aid kit with multiple bottles of antibiotics and pain medication. His hands actually shook as he held the antibiotics. For Marcus, these could be the difference between recovery and a life-threatening infection progressing to sepsis. He continued searching the wreckage, finding a small cooler with water bottles, still sealed and intact, and several packages of freeze-dried meals. There was also a flare gun with a box of flares. Thomas gathered everything he could carry, and then some, packing items into garbage bags he found in the cockpit and securing them to his backpack with rope. But as he was preparing to leave, he noticed something unusual. In the rear of the cargo area, partially hidden by twisted metal, there was a sealed briefcase, the kind used for valuable documents or sensitive materials. It was locked, and the locking mechanism was jammed. Thomas didn't have time or tools to force it open. He noted its location but left it for now. Whatever documents it contained weren't relevant to immediate survival. As Thomas was exiting the wreckage, his foot caught on a piece of jagged metal and he fell forward into the snow. The impact knocked the wind out of him, and for a moment he lay there, breathing hard, assessing for injuries. His left shin had a deep cut where the metal had caught him, and blood was already seeping into his sock. It hurt, but the pain was manageable, and the injury didn't seem to affect his mobility significantly. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment. Who do you think will survive this ordeal? He bandaged the cut as best he could using his medical kit, then prepared for the journey back up the mountain. His pack was now significantly heavier. Thomas estimated he was carrying close to 50 pounds of salvaged supplies. The ascent would be harder, more exhausting, but it would also be worth it. The trip back up took nearly 3 hours, twice as long as the descent. By the time Thomas could see the flagging tape marking the entrance to the crevice shelter, he was exhausted to the point of almost hallucinating. His legs felt like they were made of lead, and his breathing was rapid and shallow from the altitude and exertion, but he pushed forward, determined to reach the shelter before his strength completely gave out. When he pulled himself into the crevice, the other 3 men looked at him like he was a ghost that had suddenly become real. "You made it," Patterson said, relief flooding his voice. "We were starting to worry." "Water," Thomas gasped. "Get me water, then help me unpack this." What followed was a moment of genuine rejoicing. The blankets meant they could now maintain warmth more efficiently. The food supplies meant they could eat something approaching adequate portions. But most importantly, the antibiotics meant they could actually treat Marcus's infection, rather than just monitor it helplessly. Patterson immediately began preparing to administer antibiotics to Marcus, explaining the medication and dosage schedule. "This changes everything," Patterson said, his medical authority firm in his voice. "If he takes these as directed and keeps the wound clean, the infection should clear up. He's not out of danger, but we've dramatically improved his chances." Marcus himself seemed to come back to life upon hearing this news. The hopelessness that had been settling over him in the previous hours was replaced by something that looked almost like optimism. Thomas shared his discovery of the various supplies, and they redistributed them carefully. They had perhaps 2 weeks of food now, if rationed carefully, assuming no other emergencies. They had multiple blankets, which would improve their warmth and their psychological state significantly. They had communication equipment that Patterson examined carefully. Some of it was damaged beyond repair, but one piece seemed to be functional. "This is a portable radio," Patterson said, examining the device. "If we can get it working, we might be able to receive communications from rescue teams. It might not transmit, the antenna is damaged, but receiving would be enough to coordinate a pickup." As evening fell in the shelter, marked only by the shift in the men's sense of time rather than any change in light, Thomas allowed himself to relax slightly. The crisis of immediate survival had shifted. They were no longer counting supplies in hours. They could count them in days. They had medical supplies. They had a way to potentially communicate with rescue teams. But Thomas also knew that mountains never fully released their grip. Something else would come. There was always something else. For tonight, though, The four men ate a meal of actual food rather than rationed survival supplies, drank water that had been heated over the stove, and prepared to sleep on blankets instead of stone floor. It wasn't comfort, not by any standard measure of civilization, but in the context of their situation, it felt like luxury. Outside the crevice, the wind had finally begun to truly diminish. The blizzard was moving on, leaving the mountains in its wake. The following days developed a rhythm. The men rose at irregular intervals. Time had become almost meaningless in the shelter, cleaned and cared for Marcus's wound according to Patterson's medical protocols, prepared meals, and passed the hours through conversation, rest, and quiet observation. The constant storm that had defined the first days had passed, replaced by cold but relatively clear weather. Through the now wider opening of the crevice, they could occasionally see blue sky, though the mountains remained snow-covered and forbidding. Thomas used the satellite device sparingly but regularly, maintaining contact with the Rescue Coordination Center. The news was mixed. A search and rescue team had been mobilized, but the weather was still too severe for helicopter operations. Ground crews were being organized, but the terrain and altitude made any ground-based approach extremely difficult and time-consuming. The message from SR was consistent. We're working on it. Stay warm, stay safe, conserve resources. On what they calculated was approximately the 7th day since Thomas had found shelter in the crevice, Captain Reeves made an unusual request. He asked to speak with Thomas privately. They moved to the back section of the crevice, away from where Patterson was monitoring Marcus's condition. "There's something I need to tell you," Reeves said, his pilot's composure cracking slightly. "About the crash. It wasn't just an accident." Thomas felt something shift in the atmosphere of the shelter. "What do you mean?" Reeves explained. The flight had been carrying sensitive cargo in addition to the 4 passengers. Corporate research materials for a pharmaceutical company, data about a new drug development. The cargo was valuable, worth millions, but more than that, it contained proprietary information that the corporation had been very careful about keeping secure. "I found a sealed briefcase in the wreckage," Reeves continued. "I didn't mention it to Patterson. I wasn't sure if I should tell anyone, but I've been thinking about it. The crash. The wind shear was reported to me by air traffic control, but my instruments didn't show anything. It was like something hit us from outside the normal weather patterns." "Are you suggesting something hit the plane deliberately?" Thomas asked carefully. "I'm suggesting it's possible. I'm suggesting that maybe someone wanted this flight to go down, and maybe that corporate data in that briefcase is more important than we realized." Thomas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain cold. "Why are you telling me this? Because if I'm right, then rescue might be more complicated than we think. The people who might have taken down this plane might not want us rescued, at least not with that briefcase intact." It was an extraordinary claim, and Thomas's first instinct was skepticism. But as he considered Reeves's experience and the certainty in his voice, he found himself taking it seriously. "Does Patterson know?" "No. I didn't want to alarm him without evidence, and I certainly didn't want to tell Marcus. He's got enough to deal with just recovering from his injuries." Thomas made a decision. "We tell Patterson. We need full information to make good decisions about security and communication. He's a doctor and seems like a practical man. We tell him, but not Marcus, and we decide together how to proceed." They brought Patterson into the discussion. His initial skepticism matched Thomas's, but like Thomas, his assessment shifted as Reeves laid out the facts. The inconsistency between instrument readings and reported weather conditions, the unusual violence of the wind shear, the very specific nature of the corporate cargo they'd been transporting. "If Reeves is right," Patterson said slowly, "then our rescue might be complicated. We need to think about what that means for communication protocols." Over the next 2 days, the 3 men discussed various scenarios. They examined the portable radio more carefully and discovered that with some careful repair work and repositioning of a partially damaged antenna, it might be capable of both receiving and transmitting short-range signals. They debated whether to activate it. Doing so might draw attention from people they didn't want attention from, but it would also greatly improve their chances of coordinating with legitimate rescue teams. If you're loving this mystery, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. The twists keep coming. And comment, do you think Reeves's theory is right? On the 9th day, as they calculated it, they received communication through the satellite device that changed everything. The message was from a different contact than their usual SAR coordinator. Thomas Brennan, this is Federal Agent Sandra Martinez with the FBI. We've taken over coordination of your rescue operation. A commercial aircraft crash has become a federal matter due to suspected sabotage. Confirm. Do you have the sealed briefcase from the cargo area? Thomas's hands went cold as he read the message. The FBI suspected sabotage. They weren't paranoid, or at least Reeves's concerns had been serious enough to trigger federal investigation. He relayed the message to Reeves and Patterson. What do I tell them? Thomas asked. The truth, Reeves said. Tell them we found the briefcase, but we left it in the wreckage. Tell them about my concerns regarding the crash circumstances. And Thomas, tell them everything. If this is really federal, then we need to be fully transparent with the actual authorities. Thomas sent a detailed message back, explaining Reeves's concerns, describing the salvaged supplies, including the briefcase location, and requesting guidance on their next steps. The response came back in pieces over the course of an hour, as Agent Martinez apparently was compiling information from multiple sources. Confirmed. Aircraft crash under investigation for sabotage. Cargo contained proprietary pharmaceutical research. Corporation has history of industrial espionage countermeasures. Briefcase recovery is critical. Do not attempt to retrieve briefcase yourselves. Possible tampering with anti-theft devices. Helicopter rescue being mobilized for tomorrow morning pending weather clearance. You will be extracted in priority sequence. Marcus Chen, first due to medical condition, then remaining survivors in order. Maintain shelter location and do not venture outside unless absolutely necessary. We're coming to get you. As the message concluded with a final statement, well done on survival, Mr. Brennan. Help is coming. Thomas felt a profound mixture of emotions. Relief that rescue was genuinely coming. Concern about the implications of sabotage and federal involvement, and a strange sense of gratitude for the mountain itself, which had sheltered them all through this ordeal, indifferent to the human drama playing out within its stone shelter. That night, Thomas sat near the crevice opening, looking out at the snow-covered peaks glowing in the moonlight. Whatever had happened to the aircraft, whatever corporate interests or sabotage might have been involved, one thing was absolutely clear. 4 strangers had found shelter together, had supported each other through crisis, and had survived. In the end, the mountain, cold and hostile as it was, had brought them together rather than tearing them apart. The helicopter arrived at first light, a black and red SR bird that seemed impossibly large against the mountain's vastness. Thomas watched it approach through the crevice opening, fascinated and relieved in equal measure. A voice crackled through the portable radio, the same radio that Reeves and Patterson had carefully repaired, confirming their location and instructing them to prepare for extraction. Marcus was wrapped carefully in blankets and secured in a rescue basket that was lowered from the helicopter. He waved as he was lifted into the aircraft, his face a mixture of pain and joy. His infection was responding well to the antibiotics, Patterson had confirmed, and with actual medical facilities available, his full recovery seemed very likely. Patterson went next, then Reeves, both ascending into the helicopter in their turn. Finally, Thomas prepared for extraction. He took one last look at the crevice that had been his shelter for 9 days. The stone walls, the soot marks from the stove on the ceiling, the spots where each man had slept. The shelter had protected them all. In a strange way, Thomas felt almost grateful to leave it in good condition, as though returning kindness to the mountain for the shelter it had provided. As the basket was winched upward and the ground fell away beneath him, Thomas experienced a moment of vertigo. The mountain spread out below him looked impossibly vast and impossibly beautiful. He could see the crash site from this height, a dark scar in the white landscape. He could see the route he'd taken down and back up, the markers he'd left. He could see the entire context of his survival mapped out in geography. Inside the helicopter, the warmth was overwhelming, almost too much after days of rationing heat. Military personnel in orange flight suits checked them over and provided water and emergency rations. A paramedic examined Marcus's knee and administered additional pain medication. Thomas sat near a window, watching the mountains recede as the helicopter gained altitude and distance. Reeves leaned over to him. "We made it," the pilot said simply. "We did," Thomas agreed. At the hospital in Denver, they were separated into different wards for medical evaluation. Marcus was admitted for continued observation and wound care. Patterson was treated for minor cold injuries and released after 4 hours of observation. His medical training had apparently been thorough enough that he'd taken good care of his own health during the shelter stay. Reeves and Thomas were both kept for more extensive evaluation. The doctors were concerned about potential organ damage from prolonged extreme cold exposure and altitude effects. But scans and blood work came back clear. Physically, they'd both endured remarkably well. If you've made it to the end of this incredible story, please leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this take time to tell properly, and drop a comment sharing your thoughts on their incredible survival. While in the hospital, Thomas was interviewed extensively by FBI agent Martinez. She was professional and thorough, asking detailed questions about the crash circumstances from his perspective, Reeves's observations, and their shelter location. She explained that the investigation had revealed disturbing evidence. "Someone did indeed tamper with the aircraft's systems," Agent Martinez told Thomas. "We found evidence of deliberate sabotage to the autopilot and weather monitoring equipment. The pharmaceutical corporation whose cargo was on board has been under investigation for illegal practices. We believe there was an attempt to steal the briefcase and its contents before anyone could retrieve it." "The briefcase," Thomas said. "You recovered it?" "We did. A special team was sent to the crash site immediately after your extraction. The contents have been secured as evidence. Your survival and the details you provided were crucial to initiating the federal investigation." Thomas was released from the hospital after 2 days. He underwent debriefing sessions with the FBI and with insurance investigators for the aircraft. He provided detailed accounts, maps, and photographs. News outlets picked up the story. The survival of 4 people in extreme conditions was compelling human interest material. Thomas found himself being referred to as the Mountain Man who saved 3 lives, which amused him more than anything else. A week after his rescue, Thomas met with the other 3 survivors at a neutral location, a restaurant in Denver that Patterson had suggested. It was strange to see them in normal clothing in the context of civilization. They looked like different men now, taller somehow, as though they'd shed something of the crisis that had bent them down. "I'm going back to guiding," Thomas announced during dinner. "I've got some time off coming, but the mountains are calling me again." Marcus nodded. "I'm taking a month off, then back to my consulting work. But honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever look at business travel the same way again. I'm stepping back from commercial piloting," Reeves said. "I've made enough in my career. I might do some wilderness charter work instead, smaller operations, better control, and no corporate cargo that might get us all killed." Patterson smiled. "I'm going back to the hospital, but I've been thinking about doing wilderness medicine training. This experience made me realize there's another side to medicine that might be worth exploring." They talked through the evening, not extensively about the trauma and crisis, but acknowledging it was there. They exchanged contact information and made promises to stay in touch, though they all somehow knew those promises would fade into occasional messages rather than regular contact. What they'd shared was profound and specific to that moment and place. Back in normal life, they would become almost strangers again, though forever linked by the experience of survival. If you love this story, leave a comment here below. I'd love to know your thoughts and answer any questions you have. If you're not yet subscribed, take this moment to subscribe and activate the notification bell so you don't miss the next videos. Thomas returned to the Colorado mountains the following month. On a clear day, he hiked back to the crevice that had sheltered them all. It looked smaller than he remembered, more ordinary. The stone walls showed no sign of the 9 days that had transformed it into a sanctuary. He placed a small marker inside, a metal plaque with the date and the names of the 4 men who had found shelter there. It seemed important to mark the place somehow, to acknowledge what it had meant. As he descended the mountain that day, Thomas understood something fundamental about survival. It wasn't about being the strongest or the most prepared. It was about finding shelter when you needed it, about working with others when circumstances demanded it, about maintaining hope when everything seemed to be against you. The mountain hadn't saved him through any act of benevolence. Rather, he had survived by understanding the mountain, respecting it, and adapting to it. The investigation into the aircraft sabotage continued, ultimately resulting in federal charges against several corporate executives and individuals for industrial espionage and attempted sabotage. The pharmaceutical research that had been on the aircraft eventually became public record and led to important advances in medical treatment. But for Thomas, the most important outcome was simpler. 4 men had gone to the mountain, faced extreme circumstances, and come back alive. The rest was just details. Sometimes the greatest miracles aren't supernatural or impossible. Sometimes they're just ordinary humans, in extraordinary circumstances, choosing to endure.